The World Chess Championship 2024, game number 1. Here we go. Gukesh D with the white pieces. The challenger starts with 1e4. And we see a French defense by Ding Liren. Usually you almost always see pawn e5 or pawn to c5 at the highest levels in classical chess. So this will be interesting to see what the players have cooked up. d4, d5, knight c3. And Gukesh is still playing fairly quickly, so I don't think he's too surprised by the French defense. Knight f6, e5, and this is called the classical variation. In the classical variation, black gives up space on the king side, so look at all of this space. This is all available for white. And what does black have in return? Well, black's going to play pawn to c5, and now black is getting the space on the queen side. So if we look over here, all of this room is space for black, right? And this pawn could push to c4, it could capture here. You can already sense what's going to happen. White's going to play on the king side, so this pawn chain points king side. White wants to utilize all of these squares, and black is going to play queen side. Black wants to utilize all of these squares. So that's the dynamic here, and the center is locked up. All of these pawns are locked at the moment. Knight c to e2 by Gukesh. Knight c6, pawn to c3, and this secures the massive pawn chain. f5 will be coming at some point for Gukesh. Now we see the first long think of the game. This was a 27-minute think by Ding Liren, and he did choose the French defense, so I'm sure he has more novelties and fresh ideas cooked up in this variation, but this must have been one of his plans. This move was only played 36 times in my database, whereas queen to b6 was played over 600 times. So let's look to keep the pressure on the queen side by Ding Liren, and let's see if Gukesh can get some kingside play going soon. Knight f3, Gukesh is still playing quickly, so we're at an hour and 59 for Gukesh, hour and 29 for Ding. And it's going to be interesting to see if this time advantage, which is a pretty significant one, plays a factor. Pawn to a4, and this pawn wants to play to a3. This is kind of a strange game in terms of teaching players how to develop, because if you look at the position, really Ding is having trouble getting the minor pieces in the game, and Gukesh isn't doing much better. They're moving a whole bunch of pawns, but that's because the center is locked up. So there's not as much of a rush to get the kings to safety and develop the minor pieces. Bishop e3, bishop e7, g4, and here comes the king side attack. And where does Ding Liren put the king? You could castle here, but it looks really scary. So I think he's going to keep the king in the center for a while. Queen to a5. This pins the pawn on c3, which opens up this idea of c takes d4, knowing that the c pawn cannot capture back. So we see bishop to g2, pawn to a3, and this threatens a takes b2, and this is the anchor of the pawn chain, right? We talked about this pawn chain here. This b2 pawn is the anchor. So this is a little bit uncomfortable for Gukesh. He has to play pawn to b3, and there is still a very slight advantage for white. This is according to the computer, but from a human perspective, you can feel black has the initiative so far. Black is the one creating the threats, right? a3 threatens this pawn. Queen a5 pins this pawn. There's already the pressure on d4. So far, Gukesh D has not put any pressure on Ding Liren, and I think that's going to be the theme of this game. C takes d4. This pawn is pinned, and there's only one move here that holds the advantage, and Gukesh finds it. It's pawn to b4. You might be wondering what happens if white plays knight takes d4. The problem is bishop h4 check is a little bit uncomfortable for the white king. After blocking, takes, now this king can't castle, and a move like g5 could be annoying for white, right? It's just putting that additional pressure on the white king. And it used to be white had the king side advantage, but that might not be true anymore after this line. So pawn to b4, found by Gukesh, strongest move. Queen retreats, knight takes d4, knight to b6, and this is a juicy outpost on c4. That knight wants to plop here, hitting the bishop, hitting the b2 square, eyeing d2, guarding this pawn. It's a really nice square for that knight. Castle, knight c4, poking at the bishop. Bishop drops back. Now bishop to d7. So it took us 16 moves, but we finally see both sides developing all of their minor pieces. The black king is probably going to stay in the center for now, and the pawns are locked up in the middle. So really, there's no rush for Ding to get his king to safety. And if we look at the clocks here, we're at an hour and 21 minutes for Gukesh to 36 minutes for Ding. So a massive time advantage for white. And that must have been part of his strategy too. I bet Gukesh wanted to pressure Ding on the clock. Queen to e2. Now we do see a 33-minute think. And the idea is Ding wants to play knight takes d4 and activate his light square bishop out to b5. So with this queen back on d1, that's about to happen. Queen to e2 sort of defends the light squares, and Gukesh wants to keep that bishop stuck back on d7, because right now the bishop is trapped behind the pawn chain. Knight takes d4 still played, knight takes d4 back, and now look for f5 to happen soon, but Gukesh does have to keep an eye on this pawn. It's attacked by the knight and the queen currently. Knight to b2, and I think what's going to happen is Ding is going to start to apply pressure to this pawn, right? So queen takes c3 is already being attacked. And this is a cool usage of the pawn on a3 defending the knight. Otherwise, queen takes b2 would be a move. So again, who's got the initiative here? Ding Liren, putting pressure, creating threats. Here we see another threat. And even though some of these threats look like one-move threats, he's still improving his position, right? Top players know how to use one-move threats to their advantage. They're good moves in addition to the threat. All right, now we see queen to e3. Queen to e3 simply defends the pawn. Rook to c8, renewing the threat of queen takes c3. All right, so Gukesh has to figure out how does he get some counterplay going here. The strongest move in the position, which holds equality, this is a 0.00 eval, is bishop to e1. In my opinion, that's a really hard move to find. You feel like you want the bishop on f2 because it helps protect the king. It keeps the rooks connected. It's on this open diagonal, not blocked by any pawns. Bishop to e1 is the strongest move. And I think part of the reason why is it's opening up the f-file for the rook and saying, all right, I'm going to shut down all of your queenside play. I'm going to use a minor piece to defend this pawn instead of trying to use the rook to defend it. Not easy to find. I think at this level, Gukesh D could have definitely found it, but he plays rook a to c1, and this just gives a slight advantage to black. Queen to c4, coming in with the queen. And one thing that Gukesh has to think about, if a queen trade happens here, that's probably going to favor black, because in the endgame, there's this pressure on the backward pawn on c3. That's the weakest pawn on the board. I always like to talk about the weakest pawn on the board. Right now, it's this pawn on c3. So Gukesh needs queens on the board, and he needs to look for the attacking play, right? f5, f6, try to open up the black king. So here's f5 by Gukesh. I think it's a good choice. f6 threatened. And now we're at 30 minutes for Gukesh, 32 minutes for Ding. And Gukesh needs to create some tough decisions for Ding Liren here. Queen to d3, offering the queen trade. And Gukesh does not want to get ground down in this endgame after the queen trade. But this puts a tough question on Gukesh. If you don't want the queen trade, where do you put this queen? There's only two options, queen f4 and queen e1. Gukesh chooses wrong. He plays queen to e1. This is a mistake. Queen to f4 was the better try, and it's because of this move. Bishop to g5. Excellent move. Poking at the rook on c1, and this rook doesn't have many squares. So it's because Gukesh keeps attacking, creating tough questions. That's what got him this advantage. Okay, so now we see rook to c2 by Gukesh, and the position is getting complicated here. Gukesh is threatening bishop takes d5 as an option, or f takes e6 as an option. So there's two strong moves here. The strongest move is to castle, and I think the reason that's so good is just to get out of the way of these threats. The second best move, which was played by Ding Liren, is rook to c4. And the threat with rook to c4 is rook takes d4, removing the defender of this rook on c2, and then queen takes c2 would be coming next. Okay, so Gukesh takes a moment to play h4 first. The bishop moves, renewing the threat of rook takes d4. And now we see queen to b1. Gukesh decides, I'm going to leave the defense of this pawn on c3. He's sacrificing the pawn to keep the rook held on c2. So this is a big concession for white, and it shows how strong black's position is. This is the best move, queen to b1. There just wasn't any way to hold all the material. So rook takes c3 played, rook takes c3, queen takes c3, and now we see f takes e6. Gukesh trying to open things up. And this is the first move of the game, I think, where there's a tough decision for Dingleren, and he chooses wrong. The best move here, it's a little bit surprising, is bishop takes e6, creating this tall pawn situation. That's a bishop trapped on a pawn chain, just like this. That's the strongest move. The bishop is now ready to attack g4. The bishop has activity. Instead, Ding chooses incorrectly. He plays f takes e6, keeping that bishop trapped. There's also the open f file against his king. Now we're looking at a slight advantage for white, whereas it was, or for black, excuse me, whereas it was a winning advantage after bishop takes e6. Okay, knight to e2 played. Good move, forking the queen and bishop. Queen takes e5. So now Gukesh is down 2 pawns. But after knight takes f4, queen takes f4, white has the bishop pair, and this king is not completely safe. The knight on b2 is not doing much at the moment, and the bishop on d7 is trapped behind the pawns. So nice job by Gukesh, I think, creating a position where he can fight. He's down 2 pawns, but he's got some counterplay. Queen c2, and now queen to c4. Strong move by Ding, being annoying again with this queen trade. Instead of queen to c2, a better move would have been bishop to c5 right away. This sacrifices the 3rd pawn, but it creates the situation Gukesh D wants. You need to keep that king in the center. That's your counterplay. This is still an advantage for black, but it's not a winning advantage. Queen to c2 is a mistake. It puts black close to the winning territory again because of queen to c4, creating the queen trade. Queen to d2. Now, if Gukesh gets a free move, he's going to play bishop c5, but he probably missed his opportunity to do it. And what does Ding do here? He castles. Excellent move. Okay, bishop to d4, hitting the bishop active, hitting that pawn, hitting the knight on b2. We're on move 32. They get a bonus at move 40. And we have 3 minutes for Gukesh and 7 minutes for Ding. So anything could still happen at this point. Knight to d3. Threatening queen takes d4 check. White defends. Rook takes f1. Bishop takes f1. These trades are helping Dingleren. We're down to just 3 pieces for Gukesh to fight back. And notice with these 2 pawns up on g4 and h4, this king is feeling a little bit airy, right? There's no pawns defending the king. So keep that in mind. The king's safety is favoring Dingleren right now, and he has the additional 2 pawns. Okay, so what should black play here? There's actually only one move that keeps an advantage for black. Everything else gives the advantage to white. e5. He finds it. e5 threatens the bishop and opens up this bishop on d7. That was the only move in this position. Bishop takes e5. Queen takes g4 check. Again, notice how the white king is in more danger than black's. Bishop to g2. Bishop to f5. Finally activating that bishop. It's been 36 moves. It's finally getting into the game. This defends d3, and it threatens bishop to e4, attacking the pinned bishop on g2. This is a great move. Bishop to g3, trying to break that pin. Still bishop to e4, though. King h2. Pawn to h6. So we're at move 38. A little bit of breathing room for the black king. But the idea here is Dingleren does not have to rush. He has the clear advantage. It's winning territory. He just needs to make 2 more moves to get bonus time on the clocks. Bishop to h3. Queen to d1. And watch out for queen to h1 checkmate. Bishop to d6. And that's the 40th move. So after queen to d1, both sides got their 30-minute bonus. So at move 40, they get an additional 30 minutes. That means it should be pretty low risk at this point for Dingleren to finish the game. So bishop d6, queen c2 check, and it forks the pawn on a2, king g3, queen takes a2, and this pawn is very quickly going to become a queen. And the problem for white is there's no good source of counterplay. This bishop needs to guard g2 because queen to g2 check is threatened if it moves. The queen needs to guard f2 because otherwise queen to f2 check is threatened if it moves. So these pieces are pretty tied down for white. and the black king is still relatively safe. Bishop e6 check played. One last trick. I like this move. If king to h7 were played, this is a massive blunder. It gives up the advantage. After this cool move, queen takes e4 check. And after the pawn takes back, bishop takes a2. And now the game is in draw territory. It's an interesting imbalance. One bishop for 3 pawns, and then a bishop for the knight. But with best play, this should be a draw. So one last little trick after bishop e6 check. And a lot of times you do want the king on h7. But Ding finds the correct move. King to h8. And Gukesh D resigns. So the champion wins game number 1 with the black pieces. No one really gave him a chance in this match. But winning game number 1 with black, I think we have a super exciting match on our hands. So stay on the ChessGoals YouTube channel every single day. I'm going to do a recap for you guys, and I will see you in game number 2.